Welcome to another episode of Synthpop Reviews. I'm really excited for this episode. In this episode, I want to talk about a list of the top 100 new wave bands. And I want to mention just a few places in which I think this list is incorrect. It's got it wrong. And then I will begin the process of reordering the list. I'm going to drop some bands or artists from the list and add in some that I feel like were unfairly excluded from this list. I just don't get how they wouldn't have made the list. So let's get started. Recently, my nephew, who's really just a few years younger than me, and he's really a good friend of mine. He recently sent me a list that he found on a website called digitaldreamdoor.com. And the list is a list of the 100 greatest new wave bands or artists. And he asked me what I thought about this list. After I went to the website and checked out the list, I really appreciate the question, and I'm also appreciative of digitaldreamdoor.com. I don't mean this video to be a critique necessarily of digitaldreamdoor.com or the person that put this list together. They're obviously big fans of new wave music, including synth-pop, and so I respect that. But I appreciate my nephew asking me about it because it got me thinking about the legacies of the various new wave bands. And I think that anytime you create a list of the best anything, pretty much, personal preferences come into play. Experiences come into play. Experiences that you've had with a particular band. Have you been to one of their concerts? Maybe you were blown away by the concert. Do you just love a particular band, even though you may know that they're not well received by the critics? I don't know. I think personal preference, personal experience, both of those things have a big effect on a top list like this, a best list of whatever it may be. Also, the familiarity that you have with the various bands or artists. All of those things come into play. This list is definitely subjective and not fully objective. Having said that, I do want to spend a minute or two talking about the list on digitaldreamdoor.com. Just so that you have a little bit of a sense of how it shakes out, how the list looks, and how the various new wave bands and artists are treated and listed and ranked in this list. And then I'm going to transition to talking about how I rank the best new wave artists and bands. And this is going to end up being a multi-part podcast series. I can't do all of this work in one episode. It's going to be a few episodes. So please come back for my future episodes continuing this process of re-ranking and creating what I think is a fair list of the 100 greatest new wave bands and artists. So that list on digitaldreamdoor.com, it's listed 1 through 100, and right at number 1, they have Talking Heads. Okay, Talking Heads, that's a great band. They're definitely new wave, and they're right at the top of the list. I can live with that. Coming in second, they have Elvis Costello, then The Police, then Blondie, then Eurythmics, then Duran Duran. Tears for Fears comes in at 7, Depeche Mode at 8, The Cars at 9, and then we get Frankie Goes to Hollywood at 10. And from there, I just want to point out a few things that stood out to me about this list and the order and the ranking for the various bands and artists. They have the band a-ha at number 11 on this list. The band B-52s is at 12. They have Spandau Ballet at 25. Talk Talk comes in at 36. And then they have New Order, the band New Order, at 40 on this list, well below Frankie Goes to Hollywood. OMD comes in at number 41. Joe Jackson at 42. They actually have quite a number of great, in my opinion, synth-pop, new wave bands and artists, all clustered in the 40s. And in addition to Joe Jackson, OMD, New Order, they also have Ultravox at 43, Erasure at 44. And then just a couple of spots below that, they have Nick Kershaw. And I love Nick Kershaw, don't get me wrong. But the idea that New Order, OMD, Erasure, and Ultravox are just slightly better than Nick Kershaw, I mean, come on. Then we have the Boomtown Rats, the Motels. They've got the Dream Academy way down at number 64. Oingo Boingo at 77, just a couple of spots ahead of Swing Out Sister. They have Icehouse, get this, all the way down at number 95. And so some of those that I just spotlighted, in some cases, the reason I mentioned those is because, in my opinion, some of those choices are a little odd. How is this possible? How is it possible that Icehouse could be at 95 and yet Planet P Project is at 80, or Dexy's Midnight Runners is at 49, Boomtown Rats at 48? And again, I acknowledge there's no accounting for taste, right? We all have different tastes, we have different opinions. This is all very subjective, and that's fine. But I do take issue with some of the choices here. A few others I want to highlight that are a little odd. Level 42 being ahead of New Order. Now, again, I love a couple of Level 42 songs, really quality stuff. But higher than New Order? Not only is Level 42 ahead of New Order, they're also ahead of OMD and Erasure. I mean, that just doesn't seem right to me. So those are just a few of the minor issues or major issues that I have with this list. There are also some glaring omissions. Bands that achieved much more than Animotion or Bow Wow Wow, and yet they did not even make the list. And I'll mention some of those bands and artists once we get into the next section of this episode. Speaking of which, it's time to do that. Now we're going to transition to, instead of talking about the list from digitaldreamdoor.com, which I'm going to post a link to in the show notes and in the description so that you can check it out for yourself. But at this point, I'm going to share with you the 100, or should we say 120, I think I might get up to 120, new wave bands that I believe deserve to be mentioned on this list. These are the notable bands, in my opinion, in the new wave genre, in new wave history. So let's talk next about how do I think about this list and how do I come to it. Now, first of all, I do have to admit that my own personal opinion weighs heavily into this list. So if there's a band that I don't think is new wave, I don't really include them in the list. I talk about some of those that I question whether they're new wave at all. Also, if I don't like anything by a particular band, I'm not even going to mention that band. It's not going to make the list. And once again, as I acknowledged earlier, some of this is based on my personal experience, my familiarity with the band, and so some of these that are on the original list I have never even heard of, and I've never heard of any music by them. And so I'm going to leave them off the list or put them in the other category. And I don't mean to offend any of the fans of these bands or the band members themselves. I think many of us have had the experience of getting to know a band and their music and just falling in love with it, regardless of what other people have even heard of the band or if it has any critical acclaim at all. We can recognize sometimes the individual beauty and we can recognize the merits of that music. So for some of us, at times, it doesn't matter what the critics think. You know, if I like the sound of this band, I like the sound of this band. Okay, so acknowledging that up front, that if I don't like a band or if I've never heard of a band, it's not really going to even make the list. So these are the bands that I like and I've heard of. And then once they pass that bar, I organize them based on what I think the world, the critics, the fans, the music industry would say about a specific band or artist. Now, I did take a different approach than the original author of the list that I've been mentioning. Instead of numbering the bands from 1 to 100, or in my case to 120 or so, instead I categorized the bands into tiers. And these are the tiers that I created. At the very top, we have essential bands and artists. Their legacies are great. They not only have a lot of fans, but they have imitators. They have other bands trying to copy their style or trying to reach somewhat close to their stature, and often trying to mimic some of their musical stylings, their methods and techniques. So these are very influential bands. Next, we have near essential. These are bands that, I wouldn't quibble with them being in the essential category. These are well thought of bands. And again, critics tend to really like them. Underneath near essential, we have excellent. These tend to be bands with multiple hits and with a strong catalog of other music that may have not been chart hits. Many of their songs may not have been chart hits or radio hits, but the music is solid, it's fun, and typically, in many cases, they have multiple songs that were played on the radio regularly back in the 80s or early 90s. Even if most people in the world may only know one or two of their songs, it wouldn't be fair to call these bands in the excellent tier, to call them one-hit wonders or something like that. These are solid, really excellent new wave bands. Next, we have the very good tier, and I feel like there's not that much distinction, at least in my mind, between very good bands and excellent. I guess the main difference for me is those in the excellent category tend to be seen by critics or music experts as being a little bit superior to those in the very good category. And then finally, we have the good category. The good category or tier is generally made up of bands or musicians who had maybe one hit or maybe two or maybe even three or four, but they were minor hits, or maybe they had one giant hit and that's it, they're one-hit wonders. These bands certainly have their fans, and in some cases they have die-hard fan bases. But in some cases, their music hasn't held up well. In other cases, they're maybe more famous or better known for other things, other styles or genres of music. They may not be included in lists of excellent bands, generally speaking. So those are the 5 tiers that I've set up and categorized some of these new wave bands into. Having said that, there are bands in the good category that I absolutely love, and same with very good, excellent, etc. There's some awesome, excellent music all throughout this list. But again, I'm trying to take into account what the music world, the music industry, critics, experts, what would they say about a particular band? Finally, I do have a list of others that may have one good song or two, or that I just feel don't even belong in the good category, but they're still worth mentioning. This might be your honorable mention section. Maybe that's what I should call it. And I also have a list of bands and musicians that I've never heard of, or that I consider to not be new wave bands. But I'm just putting them in these 2 other categories because in some cases I've never heard of them. In some cases, I don't think they're new wave. Now, before I dive into the rest of the episode, I just want to make a point about what am I considering new wave? What does new wave music mean? What do I mean by new wave? So for this list, I'm considering music from the late 70s all the way through the 80s and into about maybe 1998, 1997. So obviously, new wave bands continued to make music after that. And there were also new bands, synth-pop bands, new wave bands that came out after that. But in many cases, they were kind of mimicking the style of the 80s and early 90s. I don't consider them to be part of the new wave movement. They're more of a rebirth of that movement, and so I love many of the bands that fall into that category. And some of them, I think, have surpassed some of the legit new wave bands from the 80s and 90s, but I'm not including them in this list. We're looking strictly at the original new wave movement that started in the late 70s and continued until about 1998 or so. Okay, in the rest of this episode, we're going to focus on just a couple of the categories that I have in my list. We're going to look at the list of never heard ofs and the not new waves and other honorable mentions, and then we'll also look at the good category. And that's going to take quite a bit of time to go through all of that. So I'll do that in this episode. In future episodes, we're going to look at the very good category or tier. In another episode, the excellent category or tier, and then we'll get to near essential, and then finally essential. Okay, great. It's time to jump in. And I'm going to start with the never heard of and not new wave lists. So this again harkens back to the original list that was produced by digitaldreamdoor.com, 100 greatest new wave artists. What are some of the bands or musicians that they mentioned in that list that I think do not deserve to be on the list? Okay, let's start with not new wave. Mr. Mister. Now, I like some Mr. Mister songs. Broken Wings is great. And they have some other music that I think is fun and catchy. Reminds me of the 80s, but I just don't consider them to be new wave. I think they're more of top 40 kind of generic rock. Same with the Specials, and maybe I just don't know their music as well as I should. But the Power Station, Paul Young, again, I'm not saying that these bands don't have quality music. I am just kind of doubting whether they count as new wave. The new wave radio stations that I've listened to don't play their music, any of those 4, and they don't celebrate them as being music that fits with their station. So I guess that's one of my arguments kind of against those 4. But yeah, I don't understand why any of those four, would be listed on the list of 100 greatest bands, ahead of bands like Alphaville and others that we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, bands that I've never heard of or vaguely familiar to me, but I think that I certainly would be more familiar with these bands if they really were one of the top 100 new wave bands. So on this particular list of bands that I've never heard of or just vaguely familiar, I have Graham Parker and the Rumor, Ian Drury and the Blockheads, Planet P Project, The Tubes, The Vapors, The Members, and Frida. Again, these may just be gaps in my experience of listening to new wave and synth-pop music. And it also may be, I think, a nationality thing. I wonder if in different countries of the world, maybe these bands are much more popular, more celebrated than where I am in the United States. So I do have to keep a little humility there that, maybe I'm just ignorant of some of these fantastic bands. If that's the situation, feel free to leave me a comment and let me know why Frida deserves to be in the top 100 or Planet P Project or any of these others. Okay, now we get to the other category, or you could consider this honorable mentions category. These are the ones that I'm leaving out of my 5 tiers, but I recognize that they do have some quality work. They have quality music, in some cases, songs that I love, but I just don't think that they rise to the level of good, very good, excellent, or near essential, or essential. And this is where, even though I'm not trying to, I am absolutely guaranteed to be offending someone, because I know many of you are fans of these bands. So on this list, I put bands like Timbuk 3, I put Frankie Goes to Hollywood here. I know that they have some massive hits, but they're kind of barely new wave. I know they have a couple of songs that definitely sound new wave, but I don't think they leave a legacy that warrants putting them into one of those other tiers. Dexy's Midnight Runners. I love the song Come On Eileen. I just think that there's not much more than that. And again, I just may be unfamiliar with some of their songs. The Plimsolls are on the honorable mention list. Sisters of Mercy. I think there are 2, maybe 3 Sisters of Mercy songs that I like. I do question whether they're truly new wave, but I do put them in the honorable mention category or other category. Red Rockers. I love the song China. I think it's really cool. And I actually do have some of their other music, and there's some quality stuff there, but I just don't think they rise to the tier of good. Kajagoogoo, they have one amazing song, Too Shy. It's a little cheesy, but I just can't deny it. It's so fun and catchy, fun to listen to. But I got their best of album, and it is not good. Correct me if I'm wrong in the description below or in the episode reviews, but I just don't see a lot there with Kajagoogoo. The Jam, I put them on this list. The Boomtown Rats, Animotion. Again, one giant hit, but no legacy to speak of that I can think of. And I put Bow Wow Wow in that list as well. I am not sure why the original poster put them up so high. Some of these bands, the Tom Tom Club, again, there's a good song here or there. Definitely honorable mention, but it doesn't belong in a true tier in my opinion. And Swing Out Sister. I also put Swing Out Sister here. The original poster had Swing Out Sister in the list of the top 100. I just don't get that. They had a couple of songs that are kind of catchy. Breakout is kind of a fun song. There's also Twilight World. But other than that, the sound just doesn't hold up, in my opinion. Okay, now that I've offended a whole bunch of people, let's move on to what I consider to be the good tier. These are the bands that I think deserve to be on the list. And all of these, in my opinion, are worthy of the label good. The first one on my list, and again, this is in no particular order, they're just all equal in my mind, basically, is Nick Kershaw. I think Nick Kershaw belongs forever in the hearts of new wave and synth-pop fans. If for nothing else than for the amazing song, Wouldn't It Be Good? Just one of the best new wave songs ever produced. In my opinion, it's fantastic. Gets stuck in your head. It's like, who doesn't love this song? Now, I like multiple other songs by Nick Kershaw, Human Racing, The Riddle, and several others. And I just love Nick Kershaw's voice. And so for me, Nick Kershaw is elevated above honorable mention, even though He's really only got one giant hit that has a legacy, at least in my mind. Next, I put Till Tuesday in the good tier. The song Voices Carry is just an astounding song, gorgeous vocals. I think that alone, plus a few other quality songs, put Till Tuesday in this tier. Next, we get to a band that I personally love. If this were my list of my favorite bands, this band would be much, much higher. It's a band that very few people have even heard of, but it is well thought of. Those that are aware of it have really good opinions of this band. I admit that this is, though, my own personal opinion, lifting this band up to the good tier, and that is the band Pleasure Thieves. They have one album only, and it was toward the end of the New Wave era, but somehow they just nailed it, in my opinion. Every song on this album is worth listening to. You've got to check out Pleasure Thieves if you're not familiar with them. Okay, two more bands that if this were my list of favorite bands, which I'm going to do in the future, these would be much higher. The first of those two that I'm going to mention is Red Flag. Red Flag is a synth-pop band that came out at the very tail end of the 80s, and then they went on to this great underground synth-pop career. Once new wave and synth-pop faded into the underground, Red Flag continued, and they really were considered to be one of the best bands that helped keep synth-pop alive during the dark ages of grunge and some of the other 90s music that was out there. So Red Flag is near and dear to my heart because it did help keep synthpop alive during the rough years, the rough times. Red Flag belongs on this list, in my opinion, because of their debut album, but they have much more excellent work as well. Naive Art is the name of the album. It had a couple of radio hits for them. Russian Radio is the name of one of their songs. It charted, and it was a fantastic new wave synth-pop song. Their song called If I Ever might be even better than Russian Radio. I think personally, I like this song even better than Russian Radio. They have another great song on their debut album that should have been a bigger hit. It's called Broken Heart. And then every other song on their debut album is fun and worth listening to. If you're a new wave synth-pop fan, you're going to love it. And so I include Red Flag on this list. Why aren't they higher? It's because of the critics. They don't have the recognition that I think they deserve, partially because they came out really toward the very end of the new wave era. And so sometimes the critics, dismiss them, I think. But I don't think that should count against them. Also, some critics kind of criticize the fact that the lead singer, even though they're from California, sings their music with a bit of a British accent. Now, I don't think that should be held against them at all, especially because the members of this band, they lived in the UK in their youth. That was how they grew up speaking. So I'm not surprised that they have a little bit of a British accent still. Okay, let's set aside Red Flag for now. The next band that I mentioned that I personally would put much higher if I was talking just about my favorites, but I'm not. I'm talking about the top 100, the greatest new wave bands, and that is C'est Tout J'avoue. Now, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but C'est Tout J'avoue has some amazing music. They basically had two albums, and the first album has a wonderful song called Have in Mind, and another song called Situations. Both of those got lots of radio play where I live and still to this day are played on radio here. Their second album was extremely rare at one point. It cost hundreds of dollars if you wanted to track it down. But it recently got reissued and it's a lot easier to find now. So if you like classic Depeche Mode or other similar bands, you're going to want to check out C'est Tout J'avoue's albums, especially their debut album. Along some similar lines, we have the band Cause and Effect. Similar to C'est Tout J'avoue, they came out right at the end of the new wave era, and their debut album is called Another Minute, and it's full of good songs. Every song, in fact, is enjoyable. However, that was their major label debut, and before they got a major record deal, they released those same songs on an independent label. And I actually think it sounds better on the independent record release. That album is just called Cause and Effect by the band Cause and Effect. It was released by Exile Records, and I think it sounds even better than the a little bit more produced, professional sounding Another Minute. Their second album got a lot of critical praise, and it had 4 or 5 really quality songs on it, but that's Cause and Effect. You should definitely check them out. And they had other albums on through the 90s, and they've released some other work in the 2000s, but you should definitely check out Cause and Effect. I put the Buggles on this list, the good tier, mainly for the song Video Killed the Radio Star. I put the Hooters on this list. You may know that they wrote the song Time After Time for Cyndi Lauper, but I like a couple of their other songs as well, including All You Zombies. That's probably my favorite Hooters song. Another of their songs is called And We Danced. That's a good quality song, so I think they belong in the good tier. Another personal favorite of mine that's in the good tier is Peter Schilling. Most people know Peter Schilling for one song, Major Tom Coming Home, which that alone gives Peter Schilling a place in music history, in my opinion. That song was a follow-up to the famous David Bowie song called Space Oddity. Peter Schilling produced also much more high-quality music. In addition to Major Tom Coming Home, one of my favorite other Peter Schilling songs is The Different Story. And personally, I know that Peter Schilling produced much more high-quality music beyond just those two, but that's basically, for most fans and for critics, those are the 2 songs that he produced that they know. Okay, I need to speed this up a bit. I'm taking too long with each band. I include general public on this list. Everybody knows a couple of their songs, but beyond that, I think they don't have a whole lot, in my opinion. The band Arcadia was a side project of Duran Duran, has some good music. Gene Loves Jezebel is in this tier. Some people may quibble with them being on the new wave list, but I think they're certainly new wave. Their song Desire is a great one. I love their song Jealous, so I put them in this good category. Next, we have another example of a kind of a late stage new wave band, and that's Celebrate the Nun. This is a synth-pop band through and through. The music is just crackling with sharp, crisp synth. Their debut album, every single song is enjoyable, but they really only had 1 or 2 songs played on the radio where I live. Ordinary Town was the one that got the most airplay, but there were a couple of others, including She's a Secretary. In some parts of the world, that got some radio play. But I really enjoy this debut album, and the follow-up album is pretty good. Not as good in my opinion, but then they kind of disappeared. A couple of members of Celebrate the Nun, or at least one of them, helped to start the band Scooter, which I do not like the band Scooter at all. But Scooter is actually more famous than Celebrate the Nun. Okay, I said I was going to speed up. Let's get going. Next we have Frewer. Frewer is the band that Underworld was before it became Underworld. And it's a new wave band through and through. I love Doot Doot. I love Hey Ho Away We Go. Their debut album really is just completely full of good music. Their second album also has some good songs. So check out Frewer if you're not familiar with them. Another band on the list is The Origin. The Origin produced one of my favorite albums of the 80s and early 90s. Just beautiful music. Didn't seem to be able to sustain that on other albums, though. We also have Big Audio Dynamite on this list. Personally, I would rate them higher if it's just my favorites. They had all sorts of hits, at least that were radio hits, played on the radio. But I feel like, at least my sense is, that the way the critics look at this band, that their legacy maybe isn't quite so good. So I may be wrong about that, and so correct me in the description below, please, or in the podcast episode review area. But they certainly belong on the list of best new wave bands. Big Audio Dynamite has a fantastic greatest hits compilation that's really enjoyable, start to finish. Next, I also put the Romantics on this list. They have a couple of big hits, but not a whole lot else. Another late stage new wave band is Information Society. And again, I feel like, similar to Red Flag, Information Society was a bridge from the classic new wave era and into what became the underground new wave and synth pop era. And they are still producing music. Some wonderful songs that put them on this list include Pure Energy, What's on Your Mind, Walking Away, Lay All Your Love on Me, which is an ABBA cover, of course. And all of those songs are just from their first album, but they have all sorts of other good songs, like the song Running from their first album. But throughout the 80s and 90s, they had other good songs. I don't think the critics or the music industry thought super highly of them. and their legacy may not be quite as strong, but their legions of underground synthpop fans, including myself, would beg to differ. And I think that their songs and their hits in the 80s and early 90s qualify them for this list. Next, we have a band called Pseudo Echo. Pseudo Echo has some really good hits and then just some solid kind of generic new wave music. I think they're most famous for the song Funky Town, which is a remake of somebody else's hit, but they did it in synth-pop style, perfectly well done. I mean, it sounds great. It's just got a wonderful sound to it. One of the best new wave songs, in my opinion. In addition to that, I love their song A Beat for You. It's just a fantastic synth-pop new wave song. Also on this list, in this good tier, is Zymox, sometimes known as Clan of Zymox. Just depends on what year or album. Sometimes they go by one, sometimes they go by the other. And Zymox, their band lineup has changed several times, but I'm putting them on this list based on the strength, really, of their Twist of Shadows album. I really like the song Imagination that's on that album, but all of their songs from that album are enjoyable and are well placed in the new wave sound. This band later became something else, in the 2000s up through continuing through till today, I believe. They're kind of a totally different band now in their sound and their band lineup, but that one album, Twist of Shadows, alone puts them on this list. Next, we have bands like Rational Youth, The Motels, each with some radio hits here and there. The Beloved is on this list. I really think highly of The Beloved, but based on legacy and things like that, I'm putting them here in the good tier. The band Stabilizers. They had one fantastic album that gets them on this list. That album had the hit One Simple Thing that should have been an even bigger hit. It's such a good song. And then my absolute favorite song by them is Tyranny. Just one of the best new wave songs of the entire 80s, in my opinion. And one of my favorite songs overall. It's just fantastic. And on the strength of just those two songs, they belong on this list. But really, the whole first album is listenable, it's fun, it's enjoyable, but they do deserve to be on this list. It's a little bit of a tragedy, at least in my opinion, that their second album was never released. The rumor that I heard, and you can find out more about this online, was that the second album was produced and recorded apparently, but never released because of label politics or something strange like that. But what a tragedy. That would have been I think a really fantastic second album. Even if it wasn't close to as good as their first one, I still would love to hear it. Next, we have a band that, again, kind of helped span the end of the new wave movement through to the modern day, and that's the band Camouflage. Their debut album, Voices and Images, came out in the 80s, and it was toward the end of the 80s, but it featured the hit and really fantastic song, The Great Commandment. This was played all the time on my local radio station and in the 80s, and it continues to be played today on our local new wave radio station. A song that I enjoy just as much as The Great Commandment is That Smiling Face. I think it's excellent. I really love that song. Personally, I found their debut album to be a little bit up and down. There were several songs that I did not love, and I think some of it was, not their accents, but their writing, their lyrics. Some of the lyrics, you can tell that they didn't really speak perfect English, and that's okay, but in a couple of songs, it kind of got in the way of enjoying some of those songs on the debut album, at least for me. I love their second album, though. I feel like the band took a step forward with their second album, especially the song Love is a Shield, but there were 3 or 4 other songs on that album that really stood out to me. So personally, I love Camouflage, and they're still making music. In fact, I think some of their best work came out in the 2000s, and they're still making excellent music. But I put them in this good tier. We also have Aztec Camera. This is an interesting band. At the time in the 80s and early 90s, it seemed like Aztec Camera had a really good reputation. And I really love several of their songs. Walk Out to Winter is one of my favorites. I really like the song Good Morning Britain. And I've got their best of, and I think it's really solid. But they don't seem to have the legacy or the reputation today that I thought they would after they started out in the 80s. Some of their music may not hold up as well as we thought it would. Next up, I have Ministry, the band Ministry. Yes, it's that Ministry that you've probably heard of. They came out with an album at the beginning of their career called With Sympathy, and it's a fantastic new wave album. It's got like 3 or 4 hits that were played on the radio station locally where I live. The whole album is enjoyable and fun. Unfortunately, Ministry changed. Their sound became much harder and rockier, and they hate this first album, which is really the only thing they produced that I like. Oh, I do take that back. They did have kind of a CD full of remixes that came out. It had some 12-inch mixes, I believe, of their music, and the song Every Day is Halloween, and a few other good tracks. But I really do not count myself a fan of Ministry at all, except for this first album, which is really good. Next, we have a band that I think many of you may not be aware of. It's a band called The Railway Children. And they changed their sound a few times, but check out their best of album, their greatest hits. It's fantastic. I love almost every song on that best of. My first introduction to Railway Children was the song Every Beat of the Heart. It was played locally on our radio station, and I just love it. And I loved it really from the first couple of times I heard it. And then the song Music Stop. I like that almost as much, maybe as much as Every Beat of the Heart. But check out their best of album. It is full of beautiful music that fits right into the new wave genre. Personally, I would rate them much higher than this tier, but this is the tier that I think the world would put them into. Next is Vicious Pink. I'll just mention that there's a couple of really good songs that they have that I think put them on this list. The band Anything Box, just for one song, Living in Oblivion, I think that places them in this list in the good category. I really enjoy every song on their debut album, and they came out with several other albums that most of the world didn't notice. But their body of work is really good. You just kind of have to pick and choose sometimes which songs. There's some filler songs on some of their albums, but I think this is the right place for Anything Box. Next, we have one of my personal favorites, but they're not seen or not recognized as having much of a legacy or holding up much in the modern day, and that's Hubert Kah. The song So Many People is a fantastic song, a personal favorite of mine, and I think it merits them being on this list. But they also have a song that many people have never heard of in the United States. It's called The Picture. It's just an excellent song. And I could name 10 or 15 other songs by Hubert Kah that I personally love. One would be Machine Gun, definitely a song of the 80s, right? You can tell it was produced in the 80s. It sounds a little dated and stuff like that, but it's so fun. I love that song. Hubert Kah belongs on this list, so I put him in the good category. King is another band that I think you probably know just a few select hits of theirs. They didn't have a long legacy or discography, but they deserve to be on the list. Taste of Your Tears is one of my favorite songs by them. I put the band KTP on this list for the song Certain Things Are Likely. Just an amazing new wave synth-pop song, very well done, and they had some other good songs too. I think Captain Sensible belongs on this list. My favorite Captain Sensible song is their Christmas song called One Christmas Catalog. It's just perfection. When it comes to new wave synth-pop and Christmas, they all come together for just an amazing song. But I think most people haven't even heard of Captain Sensible, so there's not much of a legacy there. Their best of album, though, is very enjoyable. What is probably their most famous song, but check out their best of. Next, I put the Stranglers on this list on the strength of one perfect song, in my opinion, and that is Always the Sun. It's just a haunting, beautiful, gorgeous song, and I wish that they had more songs along the lines of Always the Sun with those same characteristics. They do have some other good songs, though, but nothing comes even close to Always the Sun. Next, we have the band The Farm. They came out toward the tail end of the New Wave era, and many people know their most famous song, which is All Together Now, which is about the famous Christmas truce in World War I. It's just an excellent song that holds up today. They also have many other enjoyable songs, but that's probably my favorite song by them. Okay, we're almost to the end of the list of the good tier. Also in the good tier, I put the band Concan. Concan is a very interesting band. Their first album is really solid in my opinion, and they consisted of a DJ and like a session musician. They got together and produced an album with some pretty good hits on it. Their best song is probably I Beg Your Pardon, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. And it's kind of a mashup of other people's songs. They're kind of famous for using samples and DJ effects and techniques. Some people may say, this is just kind of trash art. I disagree. I really like their song, I Beg Your Pardon, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. I also like Harry Houdini. It's a little cheesy, but it's fun nevertheless. And then they had another minor hit with the song These Boots Were Made for Walkin', which is a remix and a mashup of all sorts of things. So, okay, we're down to the 4 other bands that I consider belong in that good tier. They belong on a list of the greatest bands of the New Wave era. But, I think they belong toward the bottom of that list. And one of them is Lotus Eaters. They're kind of a lesser-known band, but check them out if you want more New Wave. The band Underworld is next. Now, many of you know that Underworld ended up with a sound that was kind of electronic, but not New Wave. But their first 2 albums are solidly New Wave. And their first album, I think, is a classic New Wave album. Every song is enjoyable, it's quality. Underneath the Radar is Underworld's most famous song that was produced during their New Wave era, and I count that as one of my all-time favorite songs. In fact, I believe that was the very first New Wave song that I ever came to appreciate. I remember being in the living room of my house that I grew up in, and my older brother, who was about 10 years older, he put that song on. It was being played on the radio. And, he was singing along to it and dancing to it. And the sound of that song sank into me. And every time that song came on, I got excited. I was just a little boy, probably 5 or 6 or 7 years old. But that song, I think, was the very first synth-pop or new wave song that I fell in love with. You've got to check out their debut album. It's great. Okay, we have 2 mentions left. There's B-Movie. In my opinion, they're a little uneven. They have a handful of songs that I really like. One song that I love, and I think it's one of the greatest new wave synth-pop songs that came out ever, which is called Nowhere Girl. Especially one of their remixes or redos of it, where it starts with this long synth piano intro. I just love that song. It's haunting and beautiful, gorgeous. Because of that song alone, they belong on this list. But again, probably toward the bottom. Okay, the final mention that I'm going to give in this good tier is Peter Godwin. A lot of people don't know him. For a long time, you could only get his music on vinyl, but he's got a couple of songs that put him on this list. Images of Heaven is a great song, and then Babies in the Mountains. Kind of weird lyrics, but I like the song. I can't help it. It's pretty good. And he has several other songs that are very good, solid songs, but the lyrics, in my opinion, don't always hold up today. I think some of the lyrics are a little bit cheesy, but because of a couple of his hits and the quality new wave sound that he has, I include Peter Godwin on this list. Okay, this is a super long episode. Thank you so much for being with me. But there we have, in my opinion, the first tier, the good tier, of the best new wave bands and musicians or artists. And I also included my list of others or honorable mentions and some that I've never heard of or that I consider not to be new wave. And maybe I just need to revisit those that I've never heard of and give them another shot or look them up. They just may be gaps in my knowledge of new wave. But I hope you enjoyed this super long episode. If you did, please come back for my future episodes where we'll look at my very good category, and then we'll move on to another episode in the excellent category, then near essential, and then finally an episode on the essential tier. But thanks again for tuning in to another episode of Synthpop Reviews. I hope you'll come back for my next episode and revisit the back catalog, my previous episodes, and see if there's something that you like. Also, please check out the synthpopreviews.blogspot.com website, where I have a link to my entire CD collection. It's a great way to discover new music, and I've got music videos and all sorts of things posted on that website. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join me again in future episodes.